The lakefront house always looked like something borrowed from another century, its wood beams darkened by age, its wide windows watching the water as if keeping secrets. I had been here countless times over the years, yet that evening the place felt heavier, as though the air itself braced for something unspoken. My brother-in-law Rufus carved his roast with theatrical pride, boasting about the marinade, while laughter scattered around the long table. I sat near the middle, hands folded neatly, listening the way I always had as a librarian, attentive, observant, rarely interrupting. Marlowe was across from me, his face calm as ever, though his eyes never lingered long on anyone. My daughter-in-law Seraphine tried to soften the mood, passing bread and commenting on the lake's reflection of the sunset. At the far end sat Cynthia. Her cheerfulness stretched too thin, urging everyone to taste the casserole she had brought. She laughed too brightly, leaned in too often, and I felt an old instinct stir a quiet prickle that something was off. When I reached for my glass, the faintest metallic tang reached my nose. I thought, absurdly, that perhaps the dishwasher hadn't rinsed properly, but the unease remained. Just then, I felt a soft brush at my elbow. Marlowe slid something folded into my hand under the table. Our eyes met. His expression was steady, unflinching. I opened the slip of paper beneath the cover of my napkin. 4 words. Pretend you're sick. Leave now. My chest tightened. I looked back at him, searching for explanation, but he only gave the slightest nod. I pressed my palm against my stomach, forced my voice to sound strained, and muttered about needing air. Chairs scraped as I rose. Seraphine half stood, concern on her face, but I waved her down with a weak smile. My shoes carried me across the hardwood into the kitchen, each step echoing too loudly. The kitchen light was harsher, the refrigerator's hum almost jarring. I leaned against the counter, heart hammering, trying to steady my breathing. Behind me, laughter swelled, then broke with a sharp clatter. A cough, a shout, the scrape of a chair, and then the sound of glass shattering as Julian, my nephew, collapsed. Just minutes earlier, the dining room had hummed with a peculiar kind of merriment, the kind that sounded practiced rather than genuine. Rufus, as always, commanded the head of the table, carving slices of roast and sprinkling each with stories about its price. The marinade, the rare cut only he could source. His voice carried the weight of someone certain that others admired him, though I knew most of us merely endured. Cynthia, seated diagonally from me, leaned forward with her casserole dish as though it were a crown jewel. "Don't be shy, just one bite will change your mind," she chirped, placing spoonfuls on plates without waiting for agreement. Her eyes didn't smile the way her mouth did. They darted quickly from plate to mouth, measuring every reaction as though tallying invisible scores. I forced a polite smile, folding my hands in my lap. Years of dinners like these had trained me well, even in my younger days, when I sensed tempers bubbling beneath polite conversation. I had swallowed my unease with careful manners, but that night, my instincts wouldn't quiet. Cynthia's attention was too sharp. Her laughter pitched too high, like a violin string wound to breaking. Marlowe kept mostly silent, his gaze shifting between Rufus and Cynthia. But I could feel his tension, the way his fingers tapped lightly against his glass. Seraphine tried to smooth things, complimenting the lake view, though her words fell flat against the stiffness in the air. Then came the first cough. Julian's, muffled and short. For a moment, I thought nothing of it, but the second was harsher, followed by the clatter of his fork against china. Chaos broke loose. Rufus shouted his name. Chairs scraped violently, and Cynthia sprang up with wide eyes, protesting about allergies. I stood frozen in the hallway, half hidden behind the doorframe, my body trembling. The siren of an ambulance wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second. As the front door opened to frantic voices and rushing feet, I pressed myself against the wall, watching as paramedics burst inside and moved straight toward the table. The sight of Julian gasping brought me back, not just to the present chaos, but to the weight of years I carried in silence. I had known struggle in a different form, long before ambulances and whispered threats at family dinners. My husband, Lowell, was gone by the time Marlo was 7, snatched from us in a mill accident that left nothing behind but debt and condolences that vanished as quickly as they came. From then on, it was only me and my boy. I stitched together a life with frayed threads, 3 jobs at once, shelving books at the library by day, cleaning offices at night, and tutoring children in between. I skipped meals so Marlo could eat seconds. I patched his shoes until they nearly fell apart, hiding the holes with polish. And when family gatherings came around, I was always the poor relation, pitied in whispers but never offered more than leftover advice. It was during those lean years that Cynthia had once been close to me. She and I walked home from church together, spoke of books, even dreamed of taking a trip we never could afford. Then, without warning, she drifted out of my life. Rumors swirled bad investments, a husband who gambled, a bitter split. Whatever the truth, she vanished, and I was left to raise Marlo without her friendship. I told my son from early on, listen with your eyes. Words are slippery, but eyes will tell you the truth. It was a mantra born of necessity, teaching him to survive where money and status failed us. Over the years, I watched him sharpen those instincts until sometimes I wondered if I had made him too cautious, too mistrustful. And now, seeing him slip me that note with such certainty, I questioned whether my lessons had become his burden. My sacrifices had forged his strength. Yes, but had they also carved suspicion into the heart of the man he had become? As the paramedics steadied Julian, I couldn't help but notice Cynthia's face across the room, pale yet calculating, her gaze lingering on me a moment too long. Julian's gasp split the room like a sudden storm. His hand clawed at his throat. His glass toppled, and wine spread across the linen like blood blooming in water. A scream rose from one of the younger cousins, high and sharp, while chairs screeched back from the table in a frantic chorus. Rufus leapt to his feet, his carving knife clattering onto the platter as he shouted for help. Seraphine's voice shook as she fumbled with her phone, trying to steady her fingers long enough to dial. The sound of her voice to the operator, urgent, cracking, barely cut through the confusion. Cynthia was already on her feet, her hands fluttering uselessly in the air. It must be an allergy, she cried, eyes wide, voice pitched higher than fear alone could explain. My gaze sharpened. Her casserole sat half empty at the center of the table, spoon still resting inside. Not once that evening had I seen her lift it to her own plate. From the kitchen archway, I stood half in shadow, watching the scene unfold with the detached clarity I once used in the library when shelving chaos into order. Every detail mattered: the tilt of Julian's head as he gasped, the sheen of sweat on Cynthia's brow, the way Marlo's jaw tightened as he bent to steady his cousin's shoulder. My body urged me forward, to press a cloth to Julian's lips, to hold Seraphine steady, to take command the way mothers do. But Marlo's note still burned in my pocket. Pretend you're sick. Leave now. His warning was no whim. He had seen something I had not, and I had trusted him enough to obey. I gripped the doorframe, torn between instinct and restraint, heart pounding with the knowledge that Cynthia's casserole might hold more than food. And if she was willing to bring it to our table, what else was she willing to risk? The commotion dulled only after the medics carried Julian out, his chest rising in shallow, rhythmic pulls. The chatter of relatives blurred into a low hum, broken by Rufus's shaky reassurances and the creak of chairs being righted. In that uneasy quiet, Marlowe touched my elbow, his grip firm yet gentle, and steered me toward the hallway, away from the others. His voice was low, meant for me alone. I didn't want to frighten you, Mother, but I couldn't risk waiting. He glanced back toward the dining room, then leaned closer. 2 nights ago, I saw Cynthia in the grocery store parking lot. She was on the phone, pacing like a trapped animal. I heard her say, "They'll pay for what happened years ago." I felt my breath catch. The words slid into me with a chill sharper than the Vermont air outside. Marlowe's eyes held mine, steady, determined. When she brought that casserole tonight, I knew. I even leaned in and sniffed it before serving. Something smelled wrong. I studied his face, the set of his jaw, the shadow of exhaustion in his eyes. My son had grown into the very watchfulness I once tried to teach him. All those years I'd said, "Listen with your eyes." I never imagined he'd carry it like a blade, ready to cut through deceit. Pride pressed against my ribs, mingled with unease. He had protected me, yes, but I sensed a weight behind his calm, as though this wasn't the first time he had borne such secrets alone. I touched his arm, feeling the pulse steady beneath his skin, and realized that the vigilance I once wielded had become his inheritance. And as Rufus's voice called for order in the dining room, I knew Cynthia wasn't the only one with shadows to unearth. The police had arrived by then, their clipped questions slicing through the air as they moved from guest to guest. Cynthia sat stiffly in her chair, her voice pitched too high, insisting again and again that Julian must have had an allergy, that her casserole was harmless, that she would never dream of hurting anyone, her hands twisted in her lap. But her eyes betrayed calculation, darting toward the dish in the center of the table as if it still held her secret. As I stood near the archway, I caught fragments of conversation between one officer and an aunt whose memory stretched far back. She whispered that Cynthia's late husband had once gone into business with Rufus, only to come out ruined. The story unfolded in broken phrases: failed investments, promises made and broken, savings gone. Cynthia had been left with nothing but bitterness. And in the years that followed, she had nursed her resentment like a wound that never closed. Suddenly, her return to our gatherings did not seem like chance, but it wasn't only Cynthia's bitterness that shadowed the table. When the officer turned to Orson, my cousin with restless eyes and a nervous laugh, his answers stumbled. I remembered the murmurs I had overheard weeks earlier: gambling debts, creditors circling like vultures. He shifted in his seat, and for an instant, his gaze met Cynthia's. It was fleeting, but enough. I understood then that her plan had not bloomed in solitude. Someone had pressed her, perhaps promised her that desperate measures were the only way left. Betrayal thickened the air, heavier than the scent of roast and wine. It was not only one dish poisoned tonight, but the trust that bound us, unraveling thread by thread. And as the officers leaned in closer, pens scratching, I knew this night's reckoning was far from finished. I slipped into the kitchen for breath. My hands braced against the counter as the murmur of questions and accusations carried from the dining room. The fluorescent light made everything stark. The gleam of steel pots, the pale porcelain bowls stacked neatly, the faint reflection of my own face in the window glass. For a moment, I saw myself as others often had a widow, fragile, tolerated at family gatherings, a figure of habit rather than influence. I remembered the years of whispered dismissals, relatives who pitied me for my patched shoes, neighbors who assumed I had no say in my own future. Even within the family, I had long been the listener, not the one whose words carried weight. Age, in their eyes, had turned me into background. But tonight was different. Tonight my eyes had caught what theirs had missed, and the weight of my silence had become unbearable. Straightening, I walked back toward the archway. The officers were still pressing Cynthia with questions, their pens poised, while the family shifted restlessly in their seats. I cleared my throat. The sound louder than I expected, and all heads turned. My voice came steadier than I felt. "Notice she hasn't eaten her own dish," I said, each word deliberate. "Watch her hands. She's sweating. That's not fear for Julian. That's guilt." The room stilled. An officer's brow arched, and he leaned closer to Cynthia, who immediately tucked her hands beneath the table. My words had landed, not as a guess, but as fact. For the first time in years, I felt something ripple outward from me authority. Quiet, yet undeniable. The weight of being overlooked shifted, and in its place was the strength I had honed through decades of endurance. I saw Marlowe's glance across the table, a flicker of pride in his eyes, and I knew I had stepped into a role long denied me. The officer nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Cynthia, and began to press her with sharper questions as the tension in the room sharpened to a knife's edge. The officer's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Then take a bite." His tone was calm, but the challenge carried the weight of final judgment. A sharp intake of breath circled the table, and every head turned toward Cynthia. Her face drained of color. She stared at the casserole as if it had suddenly transformed into something monstrous. "I told you I'm not hungry," she stammered, her voice brittle, hands trembling in her lap. The excuse floated weakly in the heavy air. That was when my gaze shifted to Orson. He had leaned back slightly, as though shrinking from notice, but I saw it the way his fork rested on the plate, barely touched, only a token smear of casserole at its edge. His eyes darted toward Cynthia and away again, guilty lightning flashing across his face. The silence grew accusing, pressing against them both. No one spoke, but the truth pulsed like a drumbeat beneath the table. Then Marlowe, calm as ever, slid his phone forward. "I've been recording since the meal began," he said quietly, almost matter of fact. "Every word, every slip she made. You'll hear her urging everyone to eat, yet never serving herself. You'll hear her contradicting her own story." A new murmur rippled through the room, half relief, half outrage. Cynthia's lips parted, but no words came. Her composure cracked completely, her hands clenching into fists against the tablecloth. I felt the ground shift beneath us all. The casserole had poisoned more than one man. It had unearthed grudges, debts, and alliances buried for decades. Proof was finally in hand, but I knew truth alone would not end the damage. And as the officer reached for Marlowe's phone, the family braced for what would come next. The clink of metal echoed louder than any voice as the officers snapped handcuffs around Cynthia's wrists. She did not fight, only sagged in her chair, eyes hollow, her once bright smile gone as if it had never existed. Orson lurched forward, words spilling in fragments, claims that he hadn't known, that he had only urged her to make Rufus listen. His stammer betrayed him, and no one rushed to defend. Then Rufus, still at the head of the table, though his throne now seemed a ruin, pressed both hands against the wood. His face had drained of its proud color, leaving him ashen. I did cheat her husband," he whispered, each syllable ragged. "Decades ago, when we invested together, I thought I could fix it before anyone knew. But he lost everything, and I let him take the blame." The confession fell heavy across us all, heavier even than Julian's collapse. Cynthia's hatred had been born there, in betrayal, left to rot for years, until it grew sharp enough to slice through the family like glass. The dining room, once staged for celebration, now resembled a battlefield of toppled chairs, spilled wine, and faces turned away. No toast could cover what had been exposed. The perfect family dinner lay in shambles, stripped of its illusions. Through the wide windows, the sirens painted the lake in fractured light red and blue, rippling over the water like broken stars. I stared at them, feeling a sorrow so deep it reached my bones. Yet beneath it lay a grim vindication. The truth had surfaced, no matter how long it had been buried. Lies could hold for decades, but not forever. Marlowe's hand brushed mine under the table, grounding me. Julian's absence weighed on us, but justice, however messy, had begun. And as the officers led Cynthia away and Orson buried his face in his hands, I understood this night would leave scars none of us could hide when morning came. Morning broke with a soft hush. The kind that settles after a storm has stripped the air clean. I sat on the porch of my farmhouse, the chipped mug warm between my palms, steam curling into the cool Vermont air. Beyond the fields, the hills held their silence, as though nature itself had paused to give me space to think. The night before replayed in fragments Julian's gasp, Cynthia's pale face, Rufus's broken confession, yet it was Marlowe I saw most clearly, his hand steady as he slipped me that folded note. I had spent a lifetime guarding him from hardship, stitching shoes, skipping meals, fighting for his education when no one else would believe in him. And last night, it was he who guarded me. I spent a lifetime protecting you, I whispered into the morning stillness. And tonight, you protected me. The words carried both pride and ache. My sacrifices had carved resilience into both of us, teaching him to see what others overlooked, to trust instinct when appearances lied. Justice had found its way to the table, though its price was steep. Betrayal had torn through the family, but truth had not drowned in the lake's dark waters. It had surfaced, raw and undeniable. I sipped my tea, letting its warmth settle in my chest. For years I had thought of myself only as a mother, defined by what I could give, by what I had lost. But as the first light struck the porch rail, I realized I was more. I was a woman who had weathered storms and still stood upright. And when instinct and love collide, I asked myself, whose voice do you trust, the one at the table, or the one that slips you a note